September 19, 1944, early morning. The fog that had blanketed Lorraine for 3 days was finally beginning to thin over the fields outside the village of Arracourt in northeastern France. Below the mist, a column of German Panther tanks belonging to elements of the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades ground westward through the murk. Their crews were confident. The low cloud had grounded American fighter bombers for days. Anti-tank guns waited in the hedgerows. The orders were clear, and for once the skies above them belonged to Germany. Then they heard it. Not the snarl of a thunderbolt, not the howl of a Mustang. Something else. A high, buzzing drone, like a lawnmower left running in a distant field. A tiny olive-drab high-wing monoplane puttered along at less than 80 miles per hour, barely 500 feet above the ground. It had no guns, no bombs, no armor, and no parachute for its crew. It weighed less than a typical automobile. Its engine produced 65 horsepower. Inside that flimsy fabric-covered cockpit sat Major Charles Carpenter, a 32-year-old former history teacher from Urbana, Illinois. He had no business being in a war. He had no business being in that cockpit. And he absolutely had no business with the 6 infantry bazookas he had strapped to the wing struts of his Piper L-4, which he had named Rosie the Rocketer. By the time that day was finished, Carpenter had flown 3 sorties over the Panther column, fired 16 bazooka rockets, immobilized 2 Panther tanks, destroyed several armored cars, and helped break the largest German armored counterattack on the Western Front since the Normandy landings. He did it in a 65-horsepower Piper Cub. The bazookas were extraordinary. What brought Carpenter to that field in the first place? What brought 5,000 other young Americans in identical tiny aircraft to battlefields across North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany was something even more dangerous, something the German High Command had been trying to eliminate since Tunisia in 1943. Something so threatening to German operations that whole columns would freeze, whole batteries would cease fire, and whole divisions would refuse to move as long as one of those little planes circled overhead. This is the story of why the most feared American aircraft on the German side of the line was the smallest, slowest, most lightly built machine in the entire Allied arsenal. The Piper J-3 Cub was, in 1940, the most ordinary airplane in America. It cost about $1,300. It weighed less than 700 pounds empty. It was built from welded steel tubing covered in doped cotton fabric and lacquer. Its Continental, a 65 4-cylinder aircraft engine, produced 65 horsepower, roughly twice the output of a typical 1940s motorcycle engine. With a single occupant, it could climb to a ceiling of 11,500 feet, cruise at 75 miles per hour, and stay aloft for about 3 hours on a 12-gallon tank. 3/4 of all American pilots who learned to fly before the war had learned in a Cub. They were everywhere because they were cheap, simple, and gentle. Flight schools bought them by the dozen. Country doctors used them to visit patients. Weekend pilots kept them in tin sheds behind farmhouses. They were as American and as unthreatening as a screen door in summer. That ubiquity became a weapon. In June of 1941, the United States Army conducted training exercises across Tennessee, and it was there that 3 officers who held civilian pilot licenses, George Patton, William Wallace Ford, and Dwight Eisenhower, pressed the case that the field artillery needed its own eyes in the sky. Patton brought his personal Stinson Model 105 Voyager, while Ford organized a group of borrowed civilian Cubs, Aeroncas, and Taylorcrafts with artillery officers in the observer seats flying alongside the ground forces below. The results were so lopsided that the exercise umpires banned the light planes halfway through. They were too effective. A single Cub at 600 feet could see 20 miles in every direction, spot the muzzle flash of an artillery piece in a tree line 6 miles away, and radio back a precise location before the gun had finished its reload cycle. Ground observers on foot could barely see 300 yards. The difference was not marginal. It was the difference between blind shooting and surgery. The Army named the new aircraft after the Piper logo that had been stitched on the civilian pilots' shirts, a small grasshopper. The name stuck. In June of 1941, the War Department ordered its first military batch under the designation O-59. On April 6, 1942, the designation changed to L for liaison. The Piper L-4 Grasshopper had arrived. The military L-4 was identical to the civilian J-3 in almost every respect. The airframe was unchanged. The engine was unchanged. The cockpit was nearly unchanged. A magnetic compass, an airspeed indicator, an altimeter, and an oil temperature gauge. The only meaningful additions were an olive-drab paint job, extra plexiglass panels above and to the rear of the cabin, giving the observer an almost unbroken view of the ground below, and a radio set designated the SCR-610, powered through a PE-120, a power supply unit, and connected to an 8-foot antenna running through the cabin roof. Without that radio, the L-4 was a pleasant recreational aircraft. With it, the L-4 became a fire direction terminal capable of calling down hundreds of shells within 60 seconds of spotting a target. Wingspan was 35 feet, 2.5 inches. Length was 22 feet, 4.5 inches. Maximum takeoff weight was 1,220 pounds. Top speed was 85 miles per hour. Stall speed was 38 miles per hour. Range was approximately 225 miles. Between April of 1942 and the end of the war, the United States Army Air Forces accepted 5,413 L-4s for service with American ground forces. At peak production, a new Cub rolled off the factory floor at Lock Haven, Pennsylvania every 20 minutes. That rate was sustained throughout the war to meet military demand. The L-4 had a more capable sibling. The Stinson L-5 Sentinel first flew on June 23, 1941, designed from a blank sheet at Stinson's plant in Wayne, Michigan. Where the L-4 was a converted civilian machine, the Sentinel was the only liaison aircraft of the war purpose-built for military use from the start. It was larger, faster, and more powerful, powered by a Lycoming O-435 engine producing 185 horsepower, giving a top speed of 130 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 15,800 feet, and a range of approximately 375 miles. 3,590 Sentinels were delivered before September of 1945. Later, variants could carry a litter casualty in the rear, making the L-5 a flying ambulance as well as an artillery spotter. On June 7, 1944, one day after the Normandy landings, an L-5 became the first Allied aircraft to land on liberated French soil, touching down behind Utah Beach. The two aircraft formed the backbone of American field artillery aviation throughout the war. Alongside them flew smaller numbers of the Stinson L-1 Vigilant, the Taylorcraft L-2, and the Aronka L-3 Defender. Together, these aircraft were called L-Birds by the men who flew them, and Maytag Messerschmitts by the men who loved them. The training to fly them was built from nothing. On June 6, 1942, exactly 2 years before D-Day, the War Department issued the directive that created organic air observation for the field artillery. A training school opened at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, using approximately 20 Piper J-3s secured from the Army Air Forces. The first class of 39 students, 20 of whom passed, called themselves the Class Before One. Among the graduates was Second Lieutenant Robert R. Williams, who would retire as a lieutenant general and is recognized today by the Army Aviation Association of America as the father of United States Army aviation. The man who built the training program was Major William Wallace Ford, later Brigadier General Ford, who had been arguing since the 1941 maneuver season that the field artillery could not fight effectively without its own aircraft. He was right, and the war would prove it on every front. Pilots were not drawn from the fighter schools. They were junior artillery officers, lieutenants, and captains, many of whom had never flown before the war. They learned to take off in 100 feet, land on unpaved roads, navigate by topographic maps folded across their knees, and stay low enough that a German fighter trying to intercept them at 350 miles per hour would stall before completing the turn. They learned the language of artillery adjustment, the radio calls that turned a spotted target into a fire mission in less than 2 minutes. A typical sortie worked like this. The pilot lifted off from a 300-foot grass strip cut alongside his battalion's howitzers, often within earshot of his own guns firing. He climbed to between 400 and 1,500 feet, high enough to see over a ridge, low enough to complicate a fighter attack. Sometimes an artillery observer flew in the rear seat with a map and a radio. When a target appeared, the observer transmitted directly to the battery's fire direction center on the ground. The call followed a precise sequence: target location by 6-digit grid coordinate, target description, method of engagement. A ranging round was fired. The observer watched where it landed and radioed a correction. Drop 200. Left 50. Another ranging round. 3 or 4 corrections bracketed the target. Then came the words German troops had learned to dread. Fire for effect. What followed was the signature of American firepower in the Second World War. A single battalion of 12 105mm howitzers could deliver 72 shells per minute. With corps artillery added, including 155mm long toms and 8-inch guns, the weight of fire doubled and tripled. By 1944, the Americans had perfected a technique called time on target, in which multiple batteries from different locations coordinated their firing so that every shell, regardless of which gun fired it or how far that gun was from the target, arrived within seconds of every other shell. The first warning a German position received was the simultaneous impact of dozens of high-explosive rounds. There was no time to take cover. There was no time for anything. Major Delbert L. Bristol, who compiled the primary statistical record of Army aviation in the European theatre, documented in the Field Artillery Journal in 1946 that American liaison aircraft accounted for better than 75% of all observed artillery fire adjustments conducted in Europe. In one of the most artillery-intensive campaigns in history, 3 out of every 4 shells that landed on a confirmed target got there because a man in a Piper Cub had seen something, called it in, and watched the rounds walk onto the objective. The Germans understood this very quickly. When an L-4 appeared overhead, German batteries ceased firing. Guns were locked in place. Vehicles pulled under trees. Soldiers froze, not because the Cub was dangerous in itself. It carried no weapons, posed no physical threat, and could be outrun by a decent bicycle on a downhill road. They froze because they knew what the Cub meant. It meant an observer in the air had eyes on them. It meant that within 90 seconds of showing themselves, the sky would open up. Veterans who survived described an experience that became almost reflexive after a few weeks at the front. They heard the engine, they looked for cover, and they did not move until the sound faded. The disruption extended beyond individual batteries. German daylight movement across the entire combat zone shrank in proportion to L-bird activity. Truck convoys moved at night, or not at all. Supply routes that were open by day became death traps. Command posts and ammunition dumps that sat 20 miles behind the front, beyond the reach of most artillery only months before, fell within range once an L-4 was up and the gunners had a 6-digit grid. Captain John Johnson, who flew L-4 missions for the 12th Corps Artillery through Patton's Third Army advance from August of 1944 to the German surrender, recalled after the war that captured German officers asked their American counterparts about what they called automatic artillery, the seemingly instantaneous response to any movement with perfectly aimed fires, as though some special device was doing the targeting. There was no special device. There was a 65-horsepower Piper Cub. The first combat deployment of the L-4 was very nearly its last. On November 9, 1942, 3 Piper L-4s assigned to Captain Ford Alcorn launched from the flight deck of the United States Carrier Ranger off the coast of Morocco. It was the first time United States Army aircraft had ever launched from a Navy carrier on a combat mission. The objective was the Fadala racetrack on the Moroccan coast, where the 3 Cubs would set up as the artillery spotting section for Patton's Western Task Force during Operation Torch. Nothing went as planned. En route to the shore, the 3 Cubs were intercepted by gunfire from the United States light cruiser Brooklyn, whose recognition manual contained no L-4 silhouette. American sailors had never seen one before, and opened fire on what appeared to be an unidentified low, slow aircraft approaching the fleet. The Cubs survived the Brooklyn encounter, only to fly into ground fire from soldiers of the 2nd Armored Division on the beach below. Both American ground fire and Vichy French fire tore into Alcorn's aircraft and wounded him in the leg. His Cub crashed on the beach. A second L-4 came down behind Vichy French lines. Its pilots were captured, then released 3 days later when the armistice took effect. The third pilot was driven down by fire from virtually every Allied unit in the area. Not a single round of American artillery was adjusted from the air before the fighting in Morocco ended. Alcorn became, in a single morning, the first Army aviator to launch from a carrier in combat, the first to be wounded in action, and the first to be shot down by his own side. By spring of 1943, in Tunisia, the story had changed. American gunners had learned the silhouette. liaison pilots had learned the front. At El Guettar and the Fondouk Pass, Patton's 2nd Corps artillery, directed largely from L4s overhead, struck German and Italian formations with a precision that Wehrmacht commanders found difficult to explain and impossible to counter. The lesson from Morocco, all of it learned in blood, had been absorbed. The grasshoppers were beginning to function the way they were meant to function. In Italy, which the Americans entered at Salerno in September of 1943, the landscape made L-birds indispensable. The Italian peninsula is a sequence of ridgelines, each overlooking the valley behind it, each providing the Germans with natural defensive positions from which they could see every Allied movement while hiding their own. Ground observation from the forward trenches was nearly useless. A man lying in a muddy foxhole could see perhaps 100 yards through the olive groves. An L4 at 1,000 feet could see the reverse slope of Monte Cassino from 20 miles. The army quickly recognized what this meant. Within weeks of the Salerno landings, L4 sections were operating from rough strips in the Volturno Valley, calling fire onto German rear area traffic that would otherwise have moved freely after dark. The Germans adapted by restricting all motor movement during daylight hours across the entire length of the Italian front, a significant operational concession forced not by tanks or bombers, but by the ceaseless circling of small artillery observation aircraft that had arrived with the first waves. By the 4th Battle of Cassino in May of 1944, L4 and L5 pilots were flying daily from improvised airstrips hacked out of the Liri Valley, walking artillery fire onto German positions on Monastery Hill that ground observers had never been able to see at all. The breakthrough that finally cracked the Gustav line was preceded by one of the most intensive aerial fire direction efforts of the Italian campaign. Coordinated from aircraft so small, the German gunners initially did not bother to shoot at them. At Anzio, the role expanded further. L-birds were ferried ashore on landing ships with makeshift flight decks built from pierced steel matting. The German railway guns that the Allied press nicknamed Anzio Annie, 2 Krupp K 5 280mm pieces, hidden in a railway tunnel in the Castelli Romani hills south of Rome, became the subject of a sustained L-bird hunt. Pilots flew long circuits over the countryside looking for the telltale smoke or disturbed vegetation that would mark the gun positions, then called in counter-battery fire that forced the German crews to move the weapons or lose them. Normandy, beginning June 6, 1944, brought the L-bird program to its largest and most consequential theatre. By the end of June, nearly every American field artillery battalion on the Cotentin Peninsula had at least 2 L-birds operating. The hedgerow country, the dense earthen banks topped with trees and shrubs that the French called bocage, made the L4 more valuable than ever. A machine gun nest behind a bocage bank was invisible from ground level 50 feet away. From 600 feet up, the pattern of disturbed earth and the angle of a gun barrel could betray the position in seconds. The cost was steep. According to Major Bristol's figures, documented in the Field Artillery Journal, 1st Army Field Artillery Aviation lost approximately 59 aircraft and 42 pilots killed in the first 3 months of the Normandy campaign, from June through August of 1944. They were not fighter pilots lost in air-to-air combat. They were artillery lieutenants in fabric airplanes, killed by machine guns, rifle fire, 20mm cannon shells, and occasionally by German fighter aircraft diving through the treetops. German tactics for neutralizing the L-birds had evolved considerably since Tunisia. The most disciplined German units simply held fire whenever a cub was overhead, accepting the reduction in their own offensive firepower as the price of not being destroyed. Vehicles stopped moving. Guns stopped firing. Soldiers became motionless. Entire batteries sat silent through an L4's circuit, then resumed operations the moment the sound of the engine faded. Unit commanders issued standing orders. No vehicle was to move on any road visible from the air, while an observation aircraft was aloft. No gun was to fire. No soldier was to expose himself on open ground. This discipline was enforced with the same rigor as any other tactical order, because the consequences of violating it were as lethal as any order on the battlefield. Camouflage became a survival skill rather than a tactical nicety. German units in France and the Low Countries became extraordinarily proficient at concealing their equipment. Tanks were covered with cut foliage and netting before dawn. Fresh tire tracks in mud were erased with rakes or walked over by cattle herded deliberately across the path. Supply convoys did not move until the last light faded and dispersed to pre-selected hides well before sunrise. Ammunition dumps were built under existing tree cover, never in open fields. All of this added friction, time, and exhaustion to every German logistics operation in the theatre. When concealment failed, the response was direct and overwhelming. German anti-aircraft units, equipped with 20mm flak-Vierling quad mounts and 37mm guns, were specifically tasked with engaging low and slow aircraft that did not match the silhouette of a fighter or a call. Bomber. These weapons were positioned near known American observation routes and around high-value targets such as fuel depots, headquarters buildings, and artillery battery positions. The standard German 88mm dual-purpose gun, though less ideally suited to the L-4's flight regime, was fired at L-birds whenever an opportunity presented itself. One direct hit from an 88 would disintegrate a cub completely. German infantry used whatever they had. The MG-42 machine gun, fired from the bipod at a low, slow target, was a genuine threat at ranges under 500 meters. The MP-40 submachine gun could reach an L-4 flying at 200 feet. Captain Johnson recalled returning from a sortie near the front, with bullet holes punched through the plywood flooring and through the fabric of the lower wing panels. The rounds had come from below. German soldiers had fired upward through the fuselage. He patched the holes with adhesive tape and flew again the following morning. When the Luftwaffe could spare aircraft for the task, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s were sent after L-birds. Intercept was technically possible but operationally treacherous. A fighter pilot approaching a 75-mile-per-hour target at 350 miles per hour needed to bleed off nearly all his speed to bring his guns to bear. At that point, flying just above stall speed at 300 feet, the fighter had no margin for error. Multiple American pilots reported watching German fighters overshoot, snap roll, and crash while trying to follow an L-4 through a sharp, low-level turn. The mathematics of interception did not favor the attacker. Whether a formal German policy of rewarding kills against L-birds was ever issued at command level remains unconfirmed in available records, but the behavioral evidence is unambiguous. The frequency of interception attempts, the dedication of anti-aircraft resources to the mission, and the consistency of German after-action reports describing observation aircraft as a primary threat all speak for themselves. On August 1, 1944, Patton's Third Army was activated and assumed command of the exploitation, driving east out of the Normandy lodgment. Every armoured column that rolled was preceded by an L-4 buzzing ahead along the axis of advance, calling in fire on German anti-tank gun positions, armoured vehicles in orchards, and infantry dug into road junctions. German commanders, who had spent months watching their positions erased by American artillery, responded in the only way left to them. They moved exclusively at night. They concealed every vehicle, every gun, and every supply dump before daybreak. They camouflaged their positions with a thoroughness that would have been incomprehensible to a German infantryman in 1942. None of it was enough. September of 1944 brought the climactic demonstration of what the L-4 program had become. The Battle of Arracourt lasted from September 18th through September 29th, 1944. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army committed approximately 180 tanks, including 75 Panzer IVs and 107 Panthers, together with 80 self-propelled assault guns, against Combat Command A of the American 4th Armored Division near the village of Arracourt in the Lorraine region of France. The fog that had grounded American fighter bombers for much of the battle left the 4th Armored's tankers to fight with artillery support and very little air cover. The L-birds kept flying. Charles Carpenter had been flying artillery observation missions in support of the 4th Armored Division since the breakout from Normandy. He had spent weeks watching German tanks operate with relative freedom on the days when fighter bombers were grounded by weather. He had also spent weeks thinking about what he could do. Sometime in August, working with his crew chief, he had begun mounting M1 infantry bazookas to the wing struts of his L-4, wiring them to a toggle switch on the control stick. He started with 2, then 4, eventually 6, 3 above each pair of jury struts, each loaded with an M6, a 3-shaped charge rocket capable of penetrating 3.5 to 4 inches of armor at a 30-degree impact angle. On the morning of September 20th, 1944, with the fog beginning to thin over Arracourt, Carpenter spotted a Panther company advancing toward a trapped American headquarters element. He dove. He fired. He returned to a forward strip to reload and flew 2 more sorties before noon. By afternoon, he had been credited with 2 Panthers immobilized and several armored cars destroyed. He had also drawn every gun on the German side of the line in his direction. That response confirmed what Carpenter had suspected. Before the bazookas, German crews had largely ignored his L-4, understanding that firing at it would only reveal their position to the American guns. After the bazookas, they shot at him with everything available the moment he appeared. He had become a direct physical threat to their armor, which meant they could no longer afford the discipline of silence when he was overhead. In subsequent engagements over the following weeks, Carpenter's total credited kills reached 6 armored vehicles. He became the only American aviator of World War II to be recognized as a tank ace, flying a 65-horsepower Piper Cub. He was awarded the Silver Star and multiple air medals. He was also diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease shortly after Arracourt, given 2 years to live, and discharged from the Army in 1946. He went back to teaching history at Urbana High School in Illinois. He died on March 22, 1966, 20 years after the diagnosis. His aircraft, Rosie the Rocketer, serial number 43-3426, was long believed lost. It was recovered at an aviation museum in Graz, Austria, in 2017, restored by the Collings Foundation, and is now preserved at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts. Arracourt was not isolated. Across the front, from the Hurtgen Forest to the Saar Valley, L-birds were flying missions that shaped the outcome of engagements far out of proportion to their numbers. During Market Garden in September of 1944, the 82nd Airborne Division's artillery air section flew daily from a strip alongside a wrecked passenger train near Nijmegen, Netherlands, directing fire across the Nijmegen salient in the face of regular German fighter attacks. On October 21, 1944, 3 Bf-109s attacked the L-4 of Lieutenant Darwin Garrard of the 320th Glider Field Artillery Battalion during a fire mission over Holland. Garrard's aircraft was hit, but flew home. American infantry on the ground shot down one of the Messerschmitts. The German pilot was unable to escape his burning aircraft and was killed in the crash. In December of 1944, Hitler's Ardennes offensive opened in fog and driving snow that shut down Allied aviation across the entire Western Front. Almost all aviation. The L-birds flew when nothing else could. During the encirclement of Bastogne, artillery, L, 4 pilots of the 101st Airborne Division, and attached field artillery units directed fire with a precision that made each of the 10 shells per gun per day. Their ammunition constraint permitted count for the Prus. Maximum possible effect. When the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne on December 26, 1944, first, Lieutenant Charles Boggess led his company through intense fighting in the village of Assenois and made contact with the surrounded garrison at 4:50 in the afternoon. L-4 spotters had been operating continuously with the 4th Armored's artillery throughout the battle, calling fire through the fog when nothing else could see the ground. The program's reach extended beyond Europe. In the Pacific, Marine Corps OY-1 Sentinels, the Marine designation for the L-5, operated from landing ship flight decks during the Saipan and Iwo Jima campaigns. The Brodie device, a cable and trapeze system designed by First Lieutenant James Brodie, was tested by Staff Sergeant R.A. Gregory, who made 10 launches and recoveries from a landing ship and was later installed operationally at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, allowing L-4 pilots to launch and recover at sea without a conventional flight deck. Army L-birds flew over New Guinea, the Philippines, and throughout the Central Pacific, directing fire against Japanese positions with the same method that had been refined over 3 years of European fighting. A Japanese prisoner, when asked what Allied aircraft his unit most feared, named the small high-wing spotter plane rather than any fighter or bomber. When the Cub was overhead, his unit stopped moving entirely and did not resume until the sound was gone. The human reality of flying these missions was one the Corps of Army aviators rarely discussed in public. The cockpit was Spartan to the point of absurdity. There was a compass, an airspeed indicator, an altimeter, and an oil temperature gauge. No artificial horizon, no directional gyro, no oxygen, no armor at any point on the airframe. No parachute on most flights, partly because there was not room, and partly because at 600 feet there was not time. The personal weapon of most pilots was a Colt M1911 pistol. Some pilots slid a steel skillet under their seat cushion to provide a minimal barrier against rifle fire from below. The flying itself required a different kind of skill than fighter or bomber aviation. L-bird pilots learned to read terrain the way a sailor reads water. They knew which ridgelines blocked radio transmission and which valleys funneled sound in ways that would carry the engine noise to German ears half a mile away. They learned which fields could support a landing in an emergency, and which ones concealed drainage ditches that would flip the aircraft on rollout. They developed the habit of watching shadows, their own and the aircraft's, because a shadow moving across open ground could alert a German observer before the engine was audible. Flying low was not merely a tactic, it was a survival requirement. An L-4 at 1,500 feet was visible for miles and reachable by nearly every anti-aircraft weapon in the German inventory. At 300 feet it was harder to see, harder to track, and so close to the ground that a fighter diving to intercept risked flying into the earth. Some pilots flew their fire missions at treetop height, pulling up only long enough to see a target or call an adjustment, then descending again. Carpenter wrote home to his family during the Lorraine campaign, describing altitudes close enough to the ground to read German road signs. He was not exaggerating much. The community of liaison pilots was tight and distinctive. They wore the patches of their artillery battalions, not those of any air group. They did not eat in separate officers' messes or sleep in separate barracks. They lived alongside their guns, in the same mud, eating the same rations, hearing the same incoming fire as the enlisted gunners and the battery officers they flew for. What separated them from the infantry was only the sound of their engine and the view from 800 feet. What they saw from that altitude, and what they did with it, shaped the outcome of battles that soldiers on the ground were fighting in near complete ignorance of what was happening 2 ridgelines away. Maintenance was a constant improvisation. Spare parts for the L-4 were rarely prioritized in supply channels designed for tanks, trucks, and howitzers. Pilots and crew chiefs patched bullet holes in the fabric with surgical tape, replaced bent landing gear legs with pieces fabricated from field equipment, and kept engines running past their scheduled overhaul intervals because there was no replacement available, and a battery without its spotter was a battery firing blind. The Continental A-65 had been designed for civilian flying at moderate hours and moderate altitudes. The war asked it for something far beyond that: continuous low-level operations in all weather, underground fire, with maintenance performed in the open by men who were artillery soldiers first and aircraft mechanics second. That the engines kept running was as much a testament to the stubborn competence of those crew chiefs as to the fundamental simplicity of the design. They called themselves Maytag Messerschmitts, a reference to the mechanical simplicity of their Continental engine. The humor was deliberate. These were men who knew they were flying the slowest, most fragile, most exposed aircraft on the front, and who chose to find that amusing rather than otherwise. On April 11, 1945, near the town of Dannenberg in Germany, Lieutenants Merritt Francis and William Martin of the 71st Armored Field Artillery Battalion were flying their L-4 when they spotted a German Fiesler Phi 156 Storch observation aircraft flying below them. They dove, opened their side windows, and fired their pistols at the German aircraft. Their .45 caliber rounds struck the Storch's windshield, fuel tank, and right wing. The German pilot tried to evade, clipped the ground with his wingtip, and cartwheeled into a field. Francis and Martin landed nearby, treated the wounded German pilot, and turned the 2 crew members over to approaching American tankers 15 minutes later. It remains the only confirmed instance in the history of combat aviation of an aircraft being brought down by pistol fire. The loss of American L-bird pilots across the European theatre was never compiled into a single official casualty count. What the records show in pieces is significant enough. According to Major Bristol's figures documented in the Field Artillery Journal, First Army alone lost approximately 59 aircraft and 42 pilots killed in just the first 3 months of the Normandy campaign. Individual squadrons in the China, Burma, India theatre logged steady losses over months of sustained operations. The men who flew these missions were not classified as combat aviators in the standard sense. They were artillery officers seconded to flight duties. They wore battalion patches, not group patches. They lived in tents next to their guns, ate the same rations as the infantrymen whose assaults they supported, and repaired their own aircraft with surgical tape and spare fabric until supplies arrived. The American program was not unique. The British Royal Artillery had reached the same conclusion independently and had been deploying air observation post squadrons since the North African campaign of 1942. The 1st RAF Air-OP Unit, No. 651 Squadron, landed at Algiers on November 12, 1942, 4 days after Ford Alcorn's disaster off the Moroccan coast. British Air-OP pilots flew Taylorcraft Osters, a close relative of the American L-2, and were commissioned Royal Artillery officers flying under RAF, Administrative Command. 12 RAF Air-OP squadrons, along with 1 Polish and 3 Royal Canadian Air Force squadrons, flew Osters across North Africa, Italy, France, the Low Countries, Germany, and Burma. Among the Canadian Air-OP pilots was a young artillery officer named James Doohan, who would later become internationally known under a different name and in a fictional capacity far removed from artillery spotting over the Rhine. The Germans had an aircraft that could have performed the same mission. The Fiesler Fi-156 Storch was in many respects the finest short takeoff and landing aircraft of the war, with extraordinary low-speed handling, powerful leading-edge slats, and a range and ceiling superior to the L-4. Rommel used one as his personal command transport across the Western Desert. The Storch rescued Benito Mussolini from his mountain prison on the Gran Sasso in September of 1943, in one of the most audacious small aircraft operations of the war. About 2,900 Storch were built across German and occupied French production lines, a substantial number. But the problem was never availability. It was doctrine. Germany never made the Storch organic to artillery battalions. It remained a command and communications aircraft, assigned to senior officers for personal transport and high-level liaison, not tasked to young artillery captains who needed to circle a ridgeline for 40 minutes watching for muzzle flashes. The decision reflected a fundamental difference in how the two armies understood firepower. The Americans had built a system in which a lieutenant with a radio could direct the entire weight of a corps artillery group. The Germans had concentrated fire control at higher levels, which meant their guns were powerful but their eyes were limited to what men on the ground could see. The L-4 closed that gap for the Americans. Nothing closed it for the Wehrmacht. The mass of the German field artillery remained blind, while the American field artillery saw everything. That asymmetry had consequences visible in every operational theatre from the summer of 1943 onward. American after-action reports from Italy, France, Belgium, and Germany repeat the same observation in different language. German batteries are inhibited during daylight hours. German movement is largely nocturnal. German counter-battery effectiveness against American gun positions is reduced because German spotters lack the airborne observation available to American forces. German commanders who attempted to move armor or artillery in daylight during the Arracourt battle, during the Bulge, and during the Rhineland campaign paid for it in destroyed vehicles and dead crews. It was not the Mustang that imposed this constraint on the German army. It was not the Thunderbolt. It was not the strategic bombers over the Reich. It was, persistently, relentlessly, across 3 years of combat on 3 continents, a fabric-covered airplane smaller than many of the trucks it was helping to destroy. The lineage that began with the Class Before One at Fort Sill in June of 1942 did not end with the German surrender in May of 1945. The L-4 and L-5 had created, out of necessity and improvisation, an entirely new concept in warfare. Organic aviation, aircraft owned and operated by ground combat units rather than a separate air service, tailored to the pace and requirements of the soldiers fighting on foot below. The connection between the artillery officer in the L-4 cockpit calling fire for effect over Lorraine and the attack helicopter crews of Vietnam, the observation helicopters of the Gulf War, and the unmanned reconnaissance aircraft watching over combat patrols in the 21st century is direct and unbroken. Robert Williams, the second lieutenant who graduated from the Class Before One in 1942, retired as a lieutenant general after commanding Army aviation in Vietnam, and is recognized today as the founder of what became the United States Army's aviation branch. The legacy is not sentimental, it is doctrinal. Every modern battlefield system that gives a ground commander persistent airborne eyes over his objective traces the requirement for its existence back to an argument, first pressed during the 1941 manoeuvre season, proved in the hedgerows of Normandy, perfected at Arracourt, and sustained through 200 days of combat between the beaches of France and the Rhine crossings of March 1945. Today, approximately 100 World War II liaison aircraft survive in airworthy condition around the world, with several hundred additional examples preserved in museums. The Alamo Liaison Squadron at Cannon Field in San Antonio, Texas, operates a flying collection of all 5 American L-bird types from the war, kept airborne by volunteers who believe the story deserves to be remembered in more than glass cases. Charles Carpenter's Rosie the Rocketer, the specific aircraft that fired bazooka rockets at Panthers near Arracourt in September of 1944, sits restored at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts, with the original jury strut mounting brackets still in place. The men who flew these missions have almost entirely gone now. The last survivors of the class before one and of the campaigns in North Africa and Italy have passed. A generation of veterans who called themselves Maytag Messerschmitts and flew without armor and without parachutes over the German lines to do the job that won them no headlines and no recognition outside their own artillery battalions has faded from living memory. What remains is the record they left in the after-action reports, the fire mission logs, the divisional histories, and the questions asked by captured German officers about the small, slow American aircraft that appeared before every artillery bombardment and disappeared before any fighter could reach them. The answer those German officers never quite understood was simple. There was no automatic artillery, there was no secret weapon, and no special technology. There was a 65-horsepower Piper Cub and a young man in olive drab calling adjustments into a radio, watching the rounds walk onto the target and going back up again the next morning. That is why the Germans hunted them. And that is why, in the end, the Germans never caught enough of them to make a difference.